Grand Marshal Osk Ferrin had conquered 1,142 worlds in a career that had never once required a second day. That was the number his adjutant read into the log as the first reckoning fleet came about above the blue-white curve of the planet, the Ascendancy's charts called designate Sol 3, and every archive still older than the charts called Earth. 1,142 worlds, and of those, 1,006 had returned formal compliance inside the first turn, the first hour of contact, before a single lander had so much as scorched a landing pad, because word of the Ossian Ascendancy's arrival, and of what happened to worlds that made the Ascendancy wait, traveled faster than any fleet needed to. The remaining 136 had held out longer. The longest holdout in 1,142 campaigns had lasted 9 turns, a stubborn mining consortium on a rock called Verdun whose entire planetary defense grid had been 3 orbital guns and a great deal of pride, and Ferrin still told that story at dinners, because 9 turns was the kind of number a man could laugh about afterward. The six-turn doctrine had not been named for Verdun. It had been named for the average, and averages were the only thing the Ascendancy trusted more than doctrine itself. 6 turns from first contact to formal compliance, verified, broadcast, entered into the registry as a closed campaign. Ferrin's staff had run designate Sol 3 through every predictive model the fleet carried before the autarch had signed the writ, and every model agreed. A single continental government calling itself the Terran Assembly, no standing fleet worth the name, no orbital defense grid that had ever fired on anything larger than debris, a species whose own historians described its wars as things fought over borders that moved by inches. The models gave Earth 4 turns. Ferrin, who had learned in 1,142 campaigns that models were usually optimistic about the enemy and never about the schedule, had told the autarch 6, and had meant it as a promise, not a ceiling. "Formal contact in 11 minutes, Marshal," said Vantor Ale, his second from the command tier below. Vantor had flown with him for 40 worlds and had never once needed to be told the shape of a landing plan twice, which was the only kind of loyalty Ferrin had ever bothered to reward. Terran orbital tracking has acquired the fleet. No weapons lock, no maneuvering. "They never lock," Ferrin said. "Locking a target you cannot kill is a species admitting it understands its own arithmetic. That's a good sign, Vantor. That's the sign of a species that surrenders on schedule." He believed it. That was the part that would matter later, though nobody standing on the command tier of the flagship Ferrin's word that morning could have said so. Ferrin believed it the way a man believes the floor will hold his weight, without examining the floor, because the floor had held for 1,142 worlds, and there was no data anywhere in the registry suggesting floors failed. Beneath his belief, unexamined and unhurried, the government of a planet he had never visited was already doing exactly what his models predicted, and exactly what his models could not have told him what it would cost him. The Ossian Ascendancy did not conquer worlds so much as it accumulated them, the way a very old river accumulates silt, slowly, patiently, by a process so gradual that no single year of it looked like violence even though 3 centuries of it, laid end to end, looked like almost nothing else. 1,142 tribute worlds paid quarterly assessments to a central treasury on the Ascendancy's capital, in currencies as different as their biologies, and in exchange received a single, standing promise, older than any autarch currently breathing. That the fleet, wherever it happened to be needed, would come, and that whatever local trouble a client world was too small or too poor to handle on its own, pirates, border disputes, a rival species with expansionist ideas, would be handled by a military apparatus that had never, in 3 centuries, lost a war it considered worth finishing. The promise was the entire architecture. Governors kept their seats by delivering tribute and order. The autarch's household kept its throne by delivering the fleet. And the fleet kept its reputation, campaign after campaign, by making very certain the word asterisk lost never once needed to be filed against the Ascendancy's name in the registry that every client world could, in principle, consult whenever its confidence wavered. Ferrin had built his own career inside that architecture with a craftsman's patience, and he was not, whatever Vantor Ale's dinner table stories implied, a reckless man. He had lost personnel on 40 of his 1,142 campaigns, had stood through the memorial rites for officers he trained personally, had once spent an uncompensated month negotiating a stubborn tribute world surrender terms rather than authorize a ground assault his own staff modeled at acceptable losses. Because acceptable was a word he had never much cared for once he understood whose lives it was describing. He was, by every honest measure his profession offered, good at the part of the work that involved not killing people needlessly. It was the other part, the part that required noticing, in real time, when a war had quietly stopped being the war his models described. That 1,142 easy victories had comprehensively unlearned in him, the way any long, unbroken success unlearns a mind's instinct to check its own floor. The Terran assembly capitulated at turn 1 hour and 40 minutes, faster than even Ferrin's optimistic staff had modeled. A formal broadcast carried on every channel the fleet's listening array could reach. The first minister of the Terran assembly, a composed gray-haired woman named Idris Akafer, standing before the cameras in the assembly's great glass hall in what had once been Geneva, reading a surrender that ceded orbital control, ceded the capital, ceded in language so complete that Vantor Ale actually laughed out loud on the command tier. A short surprised bark he apologized for a half-second later. All instruments of continued resistance, effective immediately, without condition. "That's a record," Vantor said. "That beats the record, Marshal." "That's not even a fight." "No," Ferrin agreed, watching the feed with the particular satisfaction of a man watching a number confirm itself. "It isn't." He did not know, could not have known, standing on a command tier 1,100 kilometers above a planet he had reduced, in his own mind, to a set of favorable numbers, that the woman on the screen had rehearsed those words for 6 years, in a room with no windows, with a man named Silas Voll standing just off camera holding a stopwatch, and that every syllable of her surrender had been engineered for exactly one purpose: to make Grand Marshal Osk Ferrin believe, as completely and as quickly as possible, that Earth was finished, so that he would do precisely what he did next, which was stop looking. The first landers touched down on the assembly plaza 40 minutes after the broadcast, in the unhurried, almost ceremonial cadence of a fleet that had done this 1,142 times before, and had long since stopped expecting anything to interrupt the choreography. Honor guard first, in dress plating polished for exactly this kind of recorded moment, then the compliance officers whose job was to formally inventory a surrendered capital, then, last and least dramatic of all, the logistics teams who would spend the following days doing what logistics teams always did on a newly compliant world, cataloging what could be requisitioned, what could be repurposed, what a conquered planet's own infrastructure could be made to give the army that had just conquered it. Vantor Ale walked the plaza himself, an hour after the first landers, in the specific satisfied silence of an officer inspecting a job well done, and found the assembly hall's great glass doors standing open and unguarded, the building inside it swept, orderly, and entirely empty of anyone with the standing to hand it over in person, and radioed the observation up to the command tier in a tone that carried even then the first faint thread of the unease that would take Ferrin's staff another 5 turns to name out loud. Silas Voll had been building the long table for 31 years, since he was younger than his own daughter was now, and he had built it on a single premise that he had never once managed to explain cleanly to anyone outside the table itself, including, especially, the 20-year-old structural engineer who had been arguing with him in a bunker 40 meters under what used to be the Jura foothills for the better part of an hour. "You're going to let them take Geneva," Aoife Marsh said. It was not a question. She had a data slate in one hand unread because she already knew every number on it, and reading it again wasn't going to change what the numbers said. "The assembly, the hall. You built the surrender broadcast yourself, Silas. I watched you time First Minister Okafor's pauses for a ** year. You're handing them the capital." "I'm handing them a building," Silas said. He was 61, silver-templed, built like a man who had spent 3 decades doing manual labor in secret, because manual labor kept a mind from circling too tightly around a plan that could not be shared with anyone who hadn't earned clearance to hear it. And he had the particular calm of someone who had already had this argument with himself, alone, many times, before Aoife ever walked into the room to have it with him out loud. A building, a broadcast tower, 4 government ministries that have been running on skeleton staff and false paperwork for 18 months, and a symbol. That's all Geneva is to the doctrine's math, Aoife, symbol and speed. Ferrin's whole campaign runs on the assumption that a symbol means the same thing to us that it means to him. "It means my mother's building is going to have an Ossian flag on it by this afternoon." Yes. He didn't flinch from it, which was, she'd come to understand over 4 years working under him, the thing that made him bearable to work for and unbearable to love. He never once pretended a cost wasn't a cost. Your mother isn't in it. Nobody's mother is in it. We spent 6 years making sure of that, and you helped make sure of that. You personally cleared 11,000 names off the residency registry, inside that district, and rerouted them through corridor stock nobody topside has ever heard of. Geneva today is 4 ministries, a broadcast hall, and 800 cubic meters of demolition charges. You and I have spent the last year wiring into load-bearing infrastructure that Ferrin's fleet has never once scanned for, because nobody in 1142 campaigns has ever needed to scan a surrendered capital for demolition charges. Surrendered capitals don't fight back. That's the whole doctrine, Aoife. That's the floor they're all standing on. Aoife set the slate down on the console harder than she meant to. 20 years old, born 9 months after the last near-miss contact scare that had convinced the table's founders they had maybe 2 more decades before a real fleet came looking. She had grown up inside a doctrine. She'd had no vote in writing. Drilled from age 12 in structural stress calculations and demolition sequencing by men and women who talked about her future in terms of turns and windows and acceptable loss thresholds, and she had spent every one of those years believing, in the abstract, that she understood what the plan cost. It was different standing in the bunker on the day the plan actually started spending. "You're betting the whole table on a fleet commander being lazy," she said. "I'm betting the whole table," Silas said, "on 1142 worlds teaching a competent man exactly the wrong lesson. That's not lazy, Aoife. That's the most dangerous kind of good at his job there is, a man who's right so often he stopped asking why." Through the bunker's narrow feed screen, 7 floors of reinforced rock above them, the first Ossian landers were already settling onto the assembly plaza, and the woman who had spent 6 years training her voice to sound exactly like surrender was stepping down from the podium into a car that would take her somewhere the Ascendancy's fleet would never think to look, because the fleet's models had already filed her, and everyone like her, under concluded. 6 kilometers from the assembly hall, in a residential block the long table's planners had spent 4 years quietly rezoning out of Geneva's official population registry. Renata Marsh stood at a kitchen window with her 11-year-old son's hand in hers and watched the sky for the specific kind of light, a thin, high, deliberate shimmer, nothing like weather, that 31 years of careful, unremarked public preparation had taught an entire generation of Terran adults to recognize without needing to be told twice what it meant. "Is that them?" Toby Marsh said. He was not asking whether the lights in the sky were Ossian landers. He knew that already. Every school on the continent had run atmospheric recognition drills disguised as astronomy units since before he could read. He was asking something else, the question under the question, the one his mother had been waiting 4 years to be asked, and had never quite finished rehearsing an answer for. "Yes," Renata said. "And it's going to be all right, because your sister has spent her whole life getting ready for exactly this Tuesday, and so has everyone she works with, and none of that gets undone just because it's finally happening instead of being a thing we talk about." It was, strictly speaking, a lie of scale rather than a lie of substance. Renata did not know, standing at that window, whether it would be all right. No more than Silas Voll standing in his bunker 40 meters down knew it either. But she had decided 4 years earlier, the day Aoife had come home white-faced from her first live demolition certification, and told her mother, in the flat, over-careful voice of someone repeating instructions rather than sharing news, that the long table's contingency plan required every registered Geneva household inside the target zone to be moved, quietly and in stages, to unregistered corridor housing before any invasion could plausibly arrive. Renata had decided that day that her job in the plan was to make sure her younger child never once saw her flinch at any part of it, whatever it cost her privately to manage. The car that came for them at 6:30 was marked, on every visible surface, as a Terran assembly relocation vehicle assigned to non-combatant civil defense, which was true in the sense that mattered to anyone checking papers, and false in every sense that mattered to the long table, whose actual routing algorithm had run Renata and Toby Marsh's names, 11 months earlier, through a corridor assignment system that had nothing to do with civil defense, and everything to do with keeping exactly 41,000 people off any registry an Ossian sweep team might later think to consult. The driver was a woman Renata had never met and would never see again, who did not speak beyond confirming names, and who drove with the unhurried, unremarkable calm of someone who had made this exact run, or one very like it, more times than she had ever expected to when she volunteered for the work. Toby watched Geneva go by out the window, the assembly hall in the distance, still standing, still theirs for another 90 minutes by the doctrine's own math, and asked, in the careful voice of a boy trying to sound braver than he currently felt, "Does Aoife know we're okay?" "She will," Renata said, and did not say the rest of it, which was that Aoife would not learn her mother and brother had cleared the corridor safely, until a coded confirmation cleared 4 separate relay checkpoints sometime after dark, and that Renata had chosen, deliberately, not to let herself imagine what her daughter's morning currently looked like. 400 meters under bedrock with a detonation collar somewhere in her future, and a country's worth of strangers' children, depending on a plan Renata had never been permitted to read the details of. She held Toby's hand instead, and watched Geneva recede behind unregistered corridor walls that had been 31 years in the building, and let that be enough of an answer for both of them. By the time First Minister Idris Akafer's rehearsed surrender reached its final line, without condition, Renata Marsh and her son were 14 kilometers from the assembly hall, in a corridor housing block that did not officially exist, eating a meal a stranger had prepared for them without being asked. And Renata understood, watching Toby eat with the particular unguarded hunger of a child who has just discovered that fear is exhausting in a way that has nothing to do with courage. That whatever came next, this part, the part where nobody had died getting her family this far, had gone exactly the way 31 years of quiet, unglamorous, mostly unthanked labor had promised it would. Turn 4 came and Ferrin declared victory 2 turns early, and the decision to do so, made in a private channel to the autarch's own household 17 minutes before the formal registry filing, before his own intelligence staff had finished the routine post-compliance sweep of the surrendered capital, was the first decision Osk Ferrin made in the Sol 3 campaign that his models had never told him to make. It was not a military decision. Ferrin knew that even as he made it, in the small, honest part of himself that 1,142 campaigns hadn't entirely burned out. Governor having Thes of the Caro conquered, had spent 4 years quietly courting the autarch's council for the marshal's chair that would open when Ferrin finally retired, and Thes had been the one to argue, in open session 6 months earlier, that the Sol III campaign was an unnecessary expenditure of fleet time better spent reinforcing the Ascendancy's fraying eastern tribute lanes, where 3 client worlds had missed consecutive quarterly payments, and a 4th had stopped answering hails entirely. Thes had lost that argument. Thes had not stopped making it in private. And Ferrin, 68 years into a life spent being right, wanted very badly to be able to tell the autarch's court, in a single line, filed under his own name, ahead of any staff review that might complicate it with footnotes, that Sol III was closed in 4 turns, a full 2 turns under doctrine, faster than any campaign in the history of the Ascendancy, while Thes was still drafting his Eastern Lanes memorandum. Compliance secured, Sol III turned 4 of 6, fastest campaign on record, full report to follow. Ferrin. The chorus network carried it within minutes to every relay in Ascendancy space, because the chorus was built to carry exactly this kind of message as fast and as widely as physics allowed. That was its entire purpose. 3 centuries of infrastructure dedicated to making sure that every tribute world, every garrison, every wavering client government in 1142 conquered systems heard, promptly and unmistakably, whenever the Ascendancy won. Grand Marshal Osk Ferrin's fastest campaign in Ascendancy history reached the Caro Conquered's council chamber while Governor Thes was still in session, and it reached the eastern tribute lanes, and it reached, 11 minutes later, a listening post on a border world called Ithran's Reach, where a resistance cell that had been quietly waiting 8 years for some sign that the Ascendancy could be made to bleed heard the words fastest campaign on record and understood. With the particular clarity of people who have spent a long time being patient, that the record had just become a target. Ferrin did not know any of that yet. Ferrin knew only that his intelligence staff, completing the routine post-compliance sweep of Geneva 40 minutes after his filing, had found the city's central grain depots and fuel reserves emptied down to the ceramic floors, the district's industrial cores cold and stripped of anything that could be repurposed inside a turn, and the assembly hall itself. The building his lander crews had photographed under an Ossian flag for the victory feed that had already gone out to 1142 worlds, entirely, echoingly empty of the government that was supposed to be inside it formally kneeling. They surrendered the asterisk building, his intelligence chief said, in the careful voice of an officer who understood she was about to make her marshal's mourning considerably worse. Not the government. First Minister Okafor's location is currently unknown. The formal kneeling ceremony required under Section 9 of the compliance writ has not occurred, and no Terran official with standing to perform it can be located. Ferrin stood on the command tier of Ferrin's word and looked down at the blue curve of a planet whose government had just handed him an empty building with the same ceremony a man might use handing over a coat he no longer needed, and felt, for the first time in 1142 campaigns, the small cold discomfort of a floor that had not, in fact, held. He did not retreat. That was the second decision his models hadn't told him to make, and it was, in its way, the more consequential one, because a retreat at turn 4 would have cost him nothing but pride, and Osk Ferrin had spent 68 years learning that pride was the one currency he could always earn back. What he could not earn back, once the chorus had carried asterisk fastest campaign on record to 1142 worlds, was a walkback. A Grand Marshal who filed compliance and then unfiled, it was not a Grand Marshal who had made a tactical adjustment. He was a Grand Marshal who had lied to the autarch's household, and there was exactly one governor in Ascendancy space who would make sure everyone remembered it. So he waited. Section 9 of the compliance writ required a formal kneeling, a surviving head of government, physically present, performing the acknowledgement ritual before Ascendancy witnesses, and Ferrin's staff spent turn 5 and turn 6 running down every lead the sweep teams generated, and every lead ran cold. First Minister Aoife had not fled off-world. Ferrin's orbital net would have caught any launch larger than a delivery drone, and it hadn't. She had simply, along with the rest of the Terran Assembly's leadership, and something in the range of 40,000 government and essential personnel, vanished into a planet whose surface area Ferrin's staff had never had cause to map in the kind of granular detail a manhunt required, because no campaign in 1142 had ever needed to hunt for a government that had already surrendered on camera. His intelligence chief, a methodical officer named Sira Kelach, who had spent 11 campaigns learning to distrust the specific silence that followed an unusually clean surrender, put the discomfort into words first. In a private briefing, Ferrin would remember afterward, as the moment he could have changed course and chose instead to wait one more turn. Marshal, in 1142 campaigns, has any surrendered government ever been this organized about disappearing? It was not, strictly, a question, and Ferrin had not treated it as one, because answering it honestly would have meant admitting, 5 turns into a campaign he had already filed as the fastest in Ascendancy history, that the floor beneath his career might not be as solid as the registry entry implied, and a man does not undo a filed victory over one officer's discomfort with an absence. Turn 6 became turn 8 became turn 12. Ferrin kept his fleet in high orbit, kept his ground garrison holding Geneva and 6 other surrendered administrative centers across 4 continents, and told the autarch's household, in increasingly compressed language, that the formal kneeling was a matter of hours, that Terran command and control had simply relocated its ceremonial functions and would present itself once the appropriate protocols were observed. He did not tell them what his intelligence chief had started quietly to suspect, that there was no protocol coming, that the Terran Assembly had surrendered a stage set and walked off it, and that somewhere on a planet the size of Sol 3, a government that knew exactly how much time Ferrin's pride would buy it had started doing something with that time that his models had never once been built to predict, because his models had never needed a category for an enemy that surrendered on purpose. Technician Ilan Cade was 26 years old, 3 campaigns into a career he had chosen specifically, because structural engineering was the one specialty in the Ascendancy's military that almost never required him to point a weapon at anyone, and he had spent the better part of turn 7 crouched in a service tunnel under Geneva's western industrial ring, with a resonance scanner in one hand and a growing, formless unease he could not yet justify to his supervisor in language a report would accept. The tunnel's bracing was wrong. Not damaged, not decayed, reinforced, in a pattern too recent and too precise to have been part of the original construction, load paths redistributed with a competence that read, to Cade's professionally trained eye, less like maintenance and more like preparation. He had flagged it in his turn 6 log as an anomaly worth a follow-up sweep, in the careful, hedged language junior technicians used when they suspected something their superiors would not want to hear confirmed, because Cade had learned, 3 campaigns in, that a Grand Marshal riding 2 turns ahead of doctrine on a filed victory did not thank the technician who found the crack in the floor. It's old infrastructure, his supervisor had said when Cade raised it in person. 60, 70 years predating contact. Old infrastructure gets reinforced. That's not a finding, Cade, that's a maintenance record. Reinforced to what tolerance, sir? Cade had run the numbers 3 times before he brought them forward, because he did not trust himself, at 26, to be right about something his supervisor was so plainly inclined to dismiss. This bracing is rated for loads this tunnel was never built to carry. Somebody spent real material and real labor, bringing 60-year-old infrastructure up to a standard nobody needed for foot traffic and cargo drones. His supervisor had looked at the readout for exactly as long as it took to decide the conversation was more trouble than it was worth continuing, and had signed off on Cade's follow-up sweep for turn 12, 5 days out, in the unhurried scheduling rhythm of an occupation that still, 6 turns past the doctrine's own deadline, believed it had all the time in the galaxy to get around to a maintenance anomaly filed by a junior technician who worried too much. Cade did not get his turn 12 sweep. The depot went at turn 281, 400 meters from the tunnel he'd flagged, and he spent the following 6 hours helping pull 3 members of his own crew out of a collapsed access corridor they should never have been standing in, and understood, sometime during that long grinding night, with a clarity that would follow him for the rest of a much shorter career than he'd planned on, that he had found the crack in the floor 5 days too early to matter, and reported it in exactly the tone that guaranteed nobody with the authority to act on it would. He was not alone in that understanding. Across 6 surrendered administrative centers, in barracks that had been provisioned for a campaign doctrine promised, would close inside a weak, ordinary soldiers who had never once needed to ration anything in 1,142 campaigns worth of institutional memory began, in the days after the depot fell, to do the quiet arithmetic that soldiers everywhere eventually do when supply lines stop being a given. How many meals were left in the stores? How many days until the next tender was due? What a man did with the answer when the answer kept getting worse. Discipline held mostly because Ferrin's garrison was professional and Ferrin's officers were competent, but it held the way a rope holds when the load on it is started, very quietly, to climb past what it was rated for, no single strand failing, every strand nonetheless bearing more than it had the day before, and every soldier on watch along Geneva's darkened perimeter beginning, without quite saying so to the soldier standing next to him, to listen a little harder to a countryside that had gone very still and did not feel, any longer, like a countryside that had surrendered. The depot at Geneva's Western Industrial Ring had held, according to the Ascendancy's own pre-campaign survey, enough refined fuel stock to sustain a garrison of Ferrin's size for 6 months without resupply from orbit. It held that stock for 11 days, and then, at 3:40 local time on the 12th, it did not hold it at all. Aoife Marsh was 400 meters underground in a service tunnel that predated the Ascendancy's arrival by 6 decades, laid down during a Cold War nobody living remembered as anything but a footnote, repurposed by the long table over 31 years of quiet labor into exactly the kind of infrastructure a demolition doctrine defense needed, and no orbital survey had ever thought to look for, because orbital surveys looked for weapons. And a bunker network built to move charges instead of soldiers didn't register on any scan calibrated to find an army. "Confirm charge integrity on segment 9, said the voice in her ear, Priti Okonkwo, 22, 2 years into the table's demolition corps, and the only person on Aoife's crew who could talk through a live wiring check without her hands shaking, which was the whole reason Silas had put her on segment 9 and Aoife on segment 11, the 2 load-bearing points nearest the depot's actual reserve, the ones that mattered. "Confirmed," Aoife said. "Segment 11's live. Silas, talk to me. Where's the sweep team?" 40 meters north of your position and moving away," Silas said, from the surface relay 2 kilometers off, in the flat-clipped register he used when he was watching 6 data feeds at once and had exactly enough attention left over to keep her calm. "They cleared the depot access 3 hours ago and logged it clean. Standard post-occupation patrol pattern. They're not looking for you, Aoife. They're looking for weapons caches, and they've found 4 decoy ones exactly where we wanted them to. And if the pattern changes, then you're 400 meters under bedrock with 11 minutes of hard cover between you and anything they can bring to bear before segment 11 goes live regardless. You know the numbers. You wrote half of them." She'd spent 14 months of her life on the stress calculations that let a fuel depot the size of a small city district come down in on itself, in under 6 seconds without so much as cracking the reinforced tunnel 30 meters beneath it. And she trusted the numbers the way she trusted her own hands, which was completely and without needing to think about it. And it was still a different thing entirely to be crouched in the dark with her palm flat against a detonation collar wired into the last of 11 load-bearing segments, listening to Preeti's breathing go careful and even over the comm, and understand that in 4 minutes she was going to take away, permanently, the one resource Ferrin's 1,142 campaigns had always been able to count on. A conquered city's own infrastructure, feeding the army that conquered it. "Segment 11's ready," she said. "Copy, hold on my mark, not yours. We do this on the window, not a second early." A pause, the particular Silas pause that meant he was checking something he didn't want to say out loud until he had to. Sweep teams stopped. Aoife's hand went still on the collar. "Stopped where?" 40 meters north. Not moving toward you. They've found something in segment 4, the decoy cache. It's fine, it's supposed to be found. That's the whole. A burst of static, half a second. And when Silas's voice came back, it had lost the flatness. "They've got a structural engineer with the sweep team. Ossian. He's reading the tunnel bracing." Reading it for what? For the fact that 60-year-old Cold War infrastructure doesn't get load-bearing reinforcement work done to ascendancy tolerances, Silas said, and for the first time in the 4 years Aoife had known him, she heard something in his voice that wasn't calm. "Aoife, they know somebody's been down there. They're not looking for weapons anymore." Silas Voll died at the surface relay point 6 minutes later, buying the window Aoife needed by doing the one thing his own doctrine had never modeled for him either. Standing in the open, on a rooftop 2 kilometers from the depot, broadcasting a false position on an unsecured channel loud enough and specific enough that the sweep team's response squad diverted its full attention to a 61-year-old man, with a rifle he hadn't fired in 15 years, instead of to the tunnel entrance 400 meters below, where a 20-year-old woman was 3 minutes from completing a detonation sequence that would end in one stroke. The fiction that Geneva could feed the army occupying it. Aoife heard it happen. That was the part she would carry afterward, longer than the guilt, longer even than the grief. She heard the exact 11 seconds of a firefight over a comm channel Silas had left open on purpose, so that whatever happened to him would happen where his crew could hear it and know, without ambiguity, that the mission had held. And then she heard the channel go to static, and she had 90 seconds left on the detonation window and a choice that was not, in any meaningful sense, a choice at all. "Segment 11, she said, and her voice did not shake, because Silas Voll had spent 4 years teaching her that the numbers didn't care whether her voice shook and the mission didn't either. "Live in 10. 9. 8. Preeti's voice from Segment 9, thin and steady. "Segment 9, live in 10. The depot came down on schedule, both segments within 0.4 of a second of each other. 6 seconds of controlled collapse that folded 11 months of refined fuel reserve, and every piece of industrial infrastructure the Ascendancy's models had assumed would sustain Grand Marshal Osk Ferrin's garrison through the winter of a campaign that was never supposed to see a winter at all, into 400 meters of rubble the tunnel beneath it never felt. At turn 200, an 81 of a campaign doctrine had promised would close at turn 6. Grand Marshal Ferrin's staff filed the first report using a word that had never once appeared in the registry entry for any of his previous 1,142 campaigns. The word was * shortage. In the days between the depot's collapse and the Long Dark's activation, while Ferrin's staff ran the arithmetic of a shortage nobody had planned a doctrine around, Deacon Ross's field teams stopped waiting for permission from a plan 31 years in the writing and started doing, in small, patient, deniable increments, the thing every resistance the galaxy had ever produced eventually learned to do once an occupier's supply lines went thin. They made every remaining resource cost more than it was worth. A convoy running rationed fuel between Geneva's coastal staging field and the interior garrison lost 4 vehicles to a culvert charge on the second night, none of them fatal to the drivers, all of them expensive enough in repair time, and diverted escort that the following night's convoy ran with triple the guard for a third of the cargo. A relay tower feeding weather and orbital tracking data to the garrison's coastal position went dark for 6 hours on the 4th night, restored only after a maintenance crew spent those 6 hours discovering, the hard way, that the tower's access ladder had been quietly rigged since long before the invasion ever arrived, by engineers who had never expected to need it and had built it anyway, because the long table's 31 years of preparation had never once assumed the war, if it came, would be short. Preeti Okonkwo led the culvert team herself, her first field command since Silas Voll's death, 22 years old and steadier under pressure than most soldiers twice her age, and she did not think of what she was doing as heroism, would have laughed, in fact, if anyone had used the word to her afterward. It was arithmetic, the same kind Aoife had run for the depot, scaled down to a single convoy and a single night. How much fear could a small, survivable strike buy, multiplied across every remaining night of an occupation running out of everything, except the ability to notice it was afraid? By the 11th night, Ferrin's garrison had stopped running convoys after dark at all, which cost them daylight hours they could not spare and taught the coastal positions night watch. In the specific quiet way fear teaches a soldier things doctrine never bothered to, that a planet gone very still was not a planet that had surrendered, and had not been, in point of fact, for a considerable time. The long dark was not weather. Aoife had known that since she was 14, sitting in a classroom 400 meters under the Jura foothills, while an instructor twice her age drew, on a slate that had seen better decades, the shape of what 31 years of the long table's engineering had actually built into the bedrock of 6 continents. Not a weapon exactly, not in the sense the word usually meant, but a grid, 11,906 buried capacitor arrays, salvaged and adapted from infrastructure most of the table's founding generation had grown up believing would only ever be used for storing power, wired across a planet's crust in a pattern that had taken 4 decades and 3 false starts to complete, designed to do exactly one thing on exactly one signal, discharge, simultaneously, into the ionosphere on the night side of the planet, precisely where and precisely when an occupying fleet's logistics doctrine required its resupply tenders to run their low, slow, unshielded transfer passes between orbit and ground. Every fleet Ferrin had ever commanded resupplied that way. It was doctrine older than Ferrin himself, older than the Six-Stern doctrine, built into the bones of how the Ascendancy fought. Garrison forces lived off conquered infrastructure for as long as the infrastructure held, and when it didn't, tender craft ran the gap on the planet's dark side, where atmospheric drag was lowest and occupied populations' own defenses. Historically, in 1142 campaigns, non-existent, could never threaten them. Nobody in the history of the Ascendancy had ever needed to shield a resupply tender against the ionosphere itself, because no world had ever had the ability, or the patience, to turn its own planet into the weapon. It went off at 2:12 local time, turn 309, timed by 4 decades of engineering to a resupply window. Ferrin's logistics staff had run on a fixed schedule since turn 7, because fixed schedules were efficient, and nothing in 1142 campaigns had ever punished efficiency. 11,906 arrays discharged within a synchronization window of 0.8 of a second, and the ionosphere above the planet's dark hemisphere lit with an aurora that would have been beautiful from a safe distance. And every tender craft running the gap that night, 61 of them, carrying the last of the fuel reserve Ferrin's fleet had shipped from 3 systems away to cover the shortage his own doctrine hadn't planned for. Lost navigation, lost shielding, lost, in most cases, everything but the hull integrity that kept them from simply coming apart in the upper atmosphere, and fell. 44 of the 61 reached the ground in pieces, 9 reached orbit again, crippled, unable to make another pass. 8 simply vanished from every tracking board Ferrin's fleet possessed, and were never accounted for at all. Vantor Ale, standing on the command tier of Ferrin's word at 2:19 local time, watching the aurora fade over a continent his marshal had declared conquered 273 turns earlier, said the thing that every officer on that tier was thinking, and none of them had found the nerve to say first. "Marshal, I don't think this is a planet that surrendered." Ferrin gave the withdrawal order at turn 331, and even then he gave it as a asterisk consolidation, because a man who had spent 68 years being right did not have the vocabulary yet to file the word that would have been honest. Consolidation meant pulling 6 scattered garrisons back to the 2 he judged defensible, meant abandoning 4 administrative centers his fleet had held under the Ascendancy's flag for less than 300 turns, meant, in the private arithmetic he had not yet said aloud to anyone, buying time to solve a supply problem that his staff's most recent projections put at 11 days from becoming a survival problem for the 8,000 ground personnel he had left holding Geneva and its neighboring district. It should have been a straightforward maneuver. Withdrawal corridors had been mapped, cleared, and held under Ascendancy patrol for the entire length of the occupation. 6 broad transit routes running from the interior administrative centers to the coastal staging fields, where the fleet's remaining shuttles could lift a garrison clear in an orderly sequence. And Ferrin's staff, chastened now, running every plan twice, checking assumptions they would not have thought to check 300 turns earlier, had confirmed all 6 corridors clear as recently as 4 hours before the withdrawal began. They had confirmed them clear because the long table had wanted them confirmed clear, for exactly as long as it took the last consolidated Ascendancy garrison to commit its full withdrawal to all 6 routes simultaneously, which was the only configuration in which the corridor's true purpose, 31 years in the planning, refined across every version of the withdrawal doctrine, assumptions the table's founders had gamed out since before Aoife Marsh was born, actually worked. She was on Corridor 4, the widest of the 6, the one Ferrin's staff had judged safest precisely, because its width made a defensive ambush statistically unlikely, standing in a maintenance alcove built into an overpass that had carried civilian traffic for 80 years before the Ascendancy ever arrived, with her hand on a trigger that controlled not a single collapse this time, but a cascading sequence. 9 separate detonation points along 4 kilometers of elevated roadway. Timed not to kill the column outright, but to sever it into isolated segments, each one small enough for the resistance teams dug in along the tree line to handle, without needing more firepower than 8 years of smuggled and improvised armament could provide. "Columns committed," said the voice in her ear, not Preety this time, not Silas, but a man named Deacon Ross who had taken over the table's field coordination in the 11 days since Silas Voll's death, and who had, in that time, become the person Aoife trusted to tell her the truth about a battlefield without softening it. Full withdrawal, all 6 corridors, 8,000 personnel and everything they can carry. Ferrin's on the lead element himself, Corridor 2. He's not staying behind this time. Copy. Her hand did not shake. It had not shaken since the depot, and she had stopped being surprised by that, though she still noticed it, the way she noticed the particular quality of the light through the alcove's narrow gap, gray and flat and ordinary, the kind of light that had fallen over this stretch of road every autumn morning of her whole life, and would fall over it the same way tomorrow no matter what happened in the next 4 minutes. Segments 1 through 9, confirm live. 9 voices, one after another, each one steady, each one carrying the particular calm the long table had spent 3 decades teaching people to carry into exactly this moment. "On my mark," Aoife said. What happened on the withdrawal corridors over the following 6 hours did not have a name in the registry, because the registry had never before needed one, and by the time Ascendancy historians got around to naming it, years later, in accounts written by people who had not been there and would spend careers arguing about whose fault it truly was. The word they settled on, more often than any other, was simply the collapse, though they meant several different collapses by it, and rarely troubled to specify which. The physical collapse came first. 9 detonation points across Corridor 4, folding an elevated roadway into a column, already strung thin and hurrying, killing few outright. That had never been the intent, and Aoife had run the calculations to make certain of it, because the Long Table's doctrine had been built, from its founding day, on the conviction that a garrison broken and scattered served the resistance's purpose better than a garrison dead, but severing 800 personnel from their column into isolated, disoriented groups with no clear line back to the staging fields and no orbital support that could reach them fast enough to matter, in terrain that 8 years of resistance fighters knew better than any survey map the Ascendancy possessed. The same pattern repeated, with local variations, on Corridors 1, 3, and 5. Executed by cells, the Long Table had spent 3 decades recruiting and training in 6 different regions, none of them known to each other by more than a call sign, none of them needing to be, because the plan had never depended on coordination beyond a single shared signal and 31 years of patient, separate preparation. Corridor 6 held, the resistance cell assigned to it lost its detonation window to a mechanical fault nobody could have predicted, and 40% of a garrison element reached the coastal fields intact, and Deacon Ross, reading the after-action numbers 3 days later, would tell Aoife it didn't matter, that 6 corridors succeeding and 1 failing was still the most complete tactical victory in the table's 31-year history, and Aoife would nod and not entirely believe him. Because the numbers on Corridor 6 were the numbers she thought about, afterward, more than any of the others. Aoife did not come through Corridor 4 clean. The 9th detonation point, closest to her own alcove, brought down a support strut she had rated conservatively, and the reality of falling debris respected her calculations exactly as much as falling debris ever respects anyone's math, which was to say approximately. A slab of roadway she had not modeled as unstable came down 8 meters from her cover, close enough that the pressure wave put her flat with her ears ringing, and a gash along her forearm she would not fully register until Deacon Ross's field medic found her 40 minutes later. She lay in the rubble for the length of time it took her hearing to come back, staring at a gray, flat, ordinary sky through a gap in the collapsed overpass, and thought, with the useless clarity that arrives in the seconds after a near miss, before the body has caught up to the fact that it survived, of her mother's kitchen window 14 kilometers away, of a coded confirmation she had sent hours earlier and not yet had answered, and of how strange it was that the last 4 minutes had cost her 1 detonation switch, an ordinary Tuesday, and very nearly her whole life, in an order that felt, lying there, entirely arbitrary. She let Preeti pull her upright before she let herself think about any of it further, because there was still a column to break and a report to send, and some things did not wait on a person's convenience, however good their reasons. The command collapse came second, and it came faster than the physical one, because it required no explosives at all. Ferrin's own recorders, mounted on every command vehicle in the withdrawal column, standard procedure across 1,142 campaigns, intended to capture footage for the chorus feed that would confirm, as it always had, an orderly ascendancy operation proceeding to plan, kept recording straight through the Corridor 2 ambush that Ferrin himself rode into, kept recording as his own escort vehicle took a hit that killed 3 of his personal guard and left him. For the first time in a career spanning 68 years and 1,142 worlds, running on foot across open ground with soldiers half his age shouting conflicting orders around him. Ferrin had been shot at before. Every officer who reached his rank had, at some point, in some minor incursion doctrine had long since filed and forgotten. but he had never in 68 years been shot at by an enemy who had already decided the outcome before the first round left a barrel. And the specific quality of that fear, he would think later, in the long, quiet weeks of the recall, was not the fear of dying. It was the fear of understanding, in real time, on his own two aging legs, sprinting across a stretch of shattered roadway toward cover. A junior officer, half his age, was screaming directions too. That everything he had built his career on believing about worlds like this one had been not merely wrong but wrong in a direction nobody, in 1142 campaigns, had ever bothered to check. He reached the cover. He survived the ambush, along with most of his personal escort, because Terran doctrine, Silas Voll's doctrine, though Ferrin would not learn the name for another 6 weeks, had never been built to kill a fleeing garrison so much as to break it, and a Grand Marshal running for his life, broadcast unedited to 1142 worlds, broke considerably more than any number of dead officers ever could have. The recorders were never meant to transmit live. That was standard doctrine too, footage compiled, reviewed, edited into the confident narrative the chorus was built to carry, then released on the Ascendancy's own schedule, in the Ascendancy's own voice. But the chorus relay network aboard Ferrin's Word had been running on automated retransmission protocols for 11 days, since the depot collapse had forced the fleet's communications staff to prioritize logistics traffic over editorial oversight. And the automated protocols did what automated protocols always did. They saw a priority-flagged command feed, and they carried it, unedited, live, to every relay in Ascendancy space, exactly as they had been built to do for every other command feed in 1142 campaigns, because no campaign before this one had ever produced a command feed that the Ascendancy would rather nobody saw. 1142 worlds watched Grand Marshal Osk Ferrin run. Governor Havinthes watched it from the Caro Concord's council chamber, on a screen that had, 4 hours earlier, been showing the routine agricultural tribute figures for the eastern lanes. And he did not smile, because Thes was a careful man who understood that a governor caught smiling at a marshal's humiliation made a very useful enemy of everyone who still owed that marshal loyalty. But he did quietly reach for the draft memorandum his staff had been refining for 6 months, the one about the fraying eastern tribute lanes, the 3 client worlds behind on payment, the 4th that had stopped answering hails, and he added to its opening paragraph a single new sentence that would be quoted within the year by every history of the Ascendancy's final decade. The doctrine that has governed Ascendancy expansion for 3 centuries has just been shown, before 1142 worlds, to have an edge. The 4th client world, the one that had stopped answering hails, answered within 6 hours of the broadcast, not to the Ascendancy, but to the 3 worlds nearest it, with a message that had been drafted in careful secrecy for over a year, waiting only for a sign that the Ascendancy's invincibility was something more than a story client worlds told each other because the alternative was too frightening to consider. The sign had arrived. The message went out. Within 9 days, 7 tribute worlds along the eastern lanes had formed what their own founding charter called, in a phrase that would outlive the Ascendancy itself, the compact of the unanswered hail. None of it happened because of Earth alone. Aoife Marsh, watching the aftermath unfold on relay feeds, the long table had spent 3 decades building the capacity to intercept, understood that clearly enough even in the first exhausted days after the withdrawal corridors went quiet, that the Ascendancy's fall, if it was truly falling, was not a building anyone on Earth had lit on fire so much as a structure that had been rotting from tribute lane resentment and governor's chamber ambition for longer than she had been alive. And that Earth's contribution had been, in the end, exactly what Silas Voll had always said it would be. Not a killing blow, but a floor giving way under a man who had never once thought to check whether it would hold. "They're not falling because we won a battle," she said to Deacon Ross, 11 days after the withdrawal, standing in the same bunker where she'd once argued with Silas about the cost of an empty capital. They're falling because everyone who was already afraid of them stopped being afraid at the exact same moment. That's not a war. That's a— she didn't have the word. A dam breaking, Ross said. Nobody ever blames the last drop of water. But it's still the drop that was standing on the crack when the crack finally gave. On the fourth client world of the Eastern Tribute Lanes, a temperate, heavily settled moon, its own people called Ven Adair, which the Ascendancy's registry listed simply as Tribute, holding 4471. A grain cooperative administrator named Sora Kesset had not answered an Ascendancy hail in 19 days when the footage of a running Grand Marshal reached her cooperative's shared terminal. And she watched it 3 times before she called the meeting she had been quietly preparing to call for the better part of a year. Ven Adair had paid its quarterly tribute without missing a cycle for 11 decades, not out of loyalty, but out of the same calculation every client world made, that the cost of paying was smaller than the cost of finding out firsthand what happened to worlds that stopped. Kesset had inherited that calculation from her mother, who had inherited it from hers, and she had spent 19 days testing it in the smallest possible way. A missed hail. Nothing more, no formal declaration, just silence where a response should have been, specifically because a formal declaration was the kind of thing that got a moon's administrator dragged before a tribunal, while silence could, if it needed to, be explained away afterward as a communications fault. "They can't come get us," she told the cooperative's council that evening, in a converted grain hall with 60 people crowded into a room built for half that many, the terminal still playing, on a loop nobody had thought to turn off, a marshal running across open ground with his own guard dying around him. Not this season. Maybe not next season either. Every ship that fleet has is either sitting broken over a planet 600 years too stubborn to know it lost, or it's been recalled to hold 7 other worlds who watched the same footage we just watched and came, tonight, to the exact same conclusion we're coming to. "And if we're wrong," said an older man near the back, a long-time council elder who had spent his whole career managing exactly the calculation Kesset's mother had taught her. "If this is the one season they decide to make an example instead, then we'll have been wrong in good company," Kesset said, standing next to 6 other worlds who made the same bet instead of alone, the way every world that's ever tried this before us was alone. She did not raise her voice. She had learned, watching her mother manage 4 decades of quiet fear disguised as prudence, that the moments that mattered least needed shouting. "I'm not asking the council to declare a war. I'm asking the council to keep doing exactly what we've been doing for 19 days, and to stop pretending it isn't already a decision." Ven Adair signed the compact of the unanswered hail's founding charter 11 days later, the 6th world to do so, and Sora Kesset, who had never fired a weapon in her life and did not intend to start, would be remembered, in the histories written a generation later, as one of 19 administrators who had done nothing more dramatic, in the moment that mattered, than refuse to answer a phone. Osk Ferrin was recalled to the Ascendancy's capital 40 days after the withdrawal, in a summons that arrived not as an honor but as a formality that everyone who received a copy of it, including Ferrin himself, understood to be something closer to an arrest with better manners. He had spent those 40 days doing the only thing left to a marshal, whose garrison had been cut in half and whose broadcast humiliation had reached every world the Ascendancy claimed. Holding what remained of his position on Sol 3, refusing the Terran Assembly's quietly extended offer, delivered, with a precision Ferrin would privately admit he almost admired, through a relay channel that traced back to nowhere the Ascendancy's intelligence staff could locate, of safe, unmolested withdrawal for any Ascendancy personnel who laid down arms within 72 hours. 6,100 of his remaining 8,000 did, in the end, take that offer, in the final 11 days before the recall summons reached him, and Ferrin filed each departure in the registry personally, by name, because it was the last duty he could still perform with anything resembling the competence that had built 1,142 worlds worth of career, and because he had begun, in those final days, to understand slowly. The way a man understands a diagnosis he has been resisting for weeks, that the campaign the autarch had signed a writ for was not merely lost, but had never, from the first turn, been the campaign he thought he was fighting. Vantor Ale, who had flown with Ferrin for 40 worlds, and had never once needed to be told the shape of a landing plan twice, did not come to the throne hall with him. Vantor had been offered, in the last chaotic days of the withdrawal, a transfer to a garrison command on a quieter world, the kind of quietly generous reassignment the Ascendancy still, even now, knew how to extend to an officer whose only real failing had been unwavering loyalty to a marshal who no longer had anything to offer it, and Vantor had turned it down, in a private message to Ferrin that arrived the morning of the recall summons and said, in its entirety, 40 worlds together, Marshal. I'm not filing off on the 41st, because the number stopped being kind to us. Whatever they do to you, I'll stand in the room for it. He did stand in the room, 3 rows back from the council floor, through all 4 hours of the accounting, and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that Ferrin's own testimony wasn't already saying more honestly than loyalty could. And when the council finally stripped his marshal of rank, Vantor resigned his own commission the same afternoon, quietly, without ceremony. Because a career built entirely on serving one man well had no obvious next chapter once that man had nothing left to be served. He stood before the Autarch's council in the throne hall on the Ascendancy's capital world 7 days after the recall summons, an old man in a uniform that had been tailored for a body 1,142 campaigns lighter and harder than the one currently wearing it, and gave an accounting that ran to 4 hours, and that the Autarch's own scribes would later describe, in the flat language official records reserved for events too large for adjectives, as the first complete admission of doctrinal failure in the history of the Ascendancy registry. You filed compliance at turn 4, Thale said, when Ferrin's accounting finally ran out of new things to admit. The autarch had not moved from his seat in 4 hours. He had the stillness of a man who had learned, 79 years in, that stillness read as authority even when a throne room's actual authority was busy leaking out through 19 unanswered tribute hails on the far side of Ascendancy space. 2 turns ahead of your own doctrine. Why? Ferrin had rehearsed a dozen answers to that question on the transport out, each one more defensible than the last, and found, standing in the hall with the weight of 1,142 worlds worth of career finally catching up to his knees, that he did not have the energy left to offer any of them. Because Governor Thess was drafting a memorandum about the eastern lanes, he said, and I wanted the registry to show my name closing a campaign before his name finished making its argument. That's the whole of it, autarch. Not doctrine, not intelligence. A man who has never lost anything wanting to be seen winning before a rival finished a sentence. The throne hall, full of council members who had spent 31 years watching the autarch reward exactly that kind of ambition in exactly that kind of officer, said nothing at all, which was, in its way, the loudest thing anyone in the room did that day. Autarch Vesemir Thale did not have Ferrin executed. That would have been the old answer. The answer 1,142 worlds of unbroken success had never required anyone to give. And Thale, 79 years old, 31 of them on the throne, watching a coalition of tribute worlds he had spent 3 decades of casual, unexamined confidence taking for granted now refusing, openly, to answer hails from his own household. No longer had the political capital to spend on an execution that would have satisfied nothing but his own wounded pride. He stripped Ferrin of rank and let him go, because letting him go cost less than the alternative, and because the thing Thale actually needed, in the 6 months that followed, was not a scapegoat but an army large enough to hold 7 rebelling tribute worlds in line, and he did not have one, because 1142 worlds of the Six-Stern Doctrine had never once required the Ascendancy to build a military that could fight more than one small war at a time. The compact of the unanswered hail grew to 19 worlds within the year. Governor Having-Thes, who had spent 4 years quietly courting the marshal's chair, and had spent the year since Ferrin's disgrace quietly courting something considerably larger, did not wait for the Autarch's council to invite him to lead the coalition forming against the throne that had ignored his Eastern Lanes memorandum for 6 months, while a marshal chased an empty building on a planet nobody had bothered to properly survey. He simply led it, and by the time Autarch Vesemir Thale understood that the thing gathering at the edges of Ascendancy space was not a series of unrelated tribute defaults, but a single coordinated collapse of everything the throne had ever assumed would hold without maintenance. There was no longer a fleet large enough, or a treasury deep enough, or a doctrine flexible enough to hold it together. Thes brought the Compact's combined fleet 19 worlds worth of vessels, most of them decades old, none of them individually a match for anything still flying an Ascendancy flag, but numerous in a way 3 centuries of unbroken success, had never once required the Ascendancy's capital defenses to plan against, into high orbit over the Ascendancy's home system 14 months after Grand Marshal Ferrin's accounting, and did not fire a single shot to get there. Because he did not need to. The Autarch's household fleet, spread thin across 7 separate rebellions and a supply crisis the Six-Stern Doctrine had never modeled for, could not muster a force to meet him, and every governor still nominally loyal to Thale's throne understood, watching the Compact's ships take up position without opposition, exactly what that absence meant. Autarch Vesemir Thale addressed his own council one final time 2 days later, not from the throne itself, but from the small private chamber behind it where, by tradition, an Autarch went only to abdicate or to die, and chose, in the end, the option that let him keep his name off the same kind of casualty list that had already claimed more of his household's dignity than he cared to calculate. The Ascendancy, he told them, in a voice his own scribes would record as steady and would privately describe, afterward, as anything but, was built on a promise the throne could no longer keep before a single shot was fired at this system. I will not spend what remains of it pretending otherwise for the sake of a chair. The Ascendancy's formal dissolution signed in the end, not by conquest, but by an abdication the Autarch's own council forced on him 14 months after a woman named Idris Akafar had read a rehearsed surrender into a camera on a planet called Earth, was carried, in a final grim irony that every history of the period would note, by the Chorus network. On the same automated retransmission protocols that had once broadcast a running marshal to 1142 worlds without anyone's permission, it reached those worlds in under an hour. It reached Earth 4 minutes after that, on a relay array the Long Table had built 31 years earlier, expecting only ever to use it for warnings. Chief Archivist Ren Asaru had spent 9 years cataloging the Ascendancy's registry before the dissolution broadcast reached the archive's own listening post, and she would spend the 11 years remaining in her career trying to decide what word belonged in the permanent record next to designate Sol 3, because every word available to her felt, in one direction or another, like it was lying about the shape of what had actually happened. Defeat was accurate and understated both at once. The Ascendancy had lost a campaign, yes, but campaigns had been lost before, in the deep archives, in the centuries before the Six-Stern Doctrine standardized victory into something that no longer needed a contingency file for its opposite, and defeat implied a single battle, a single reversal, when what the record actually showed, laid out turn by turn across the 11 months between First Minister Akafar's rehearsed surrender and Autarch Thale's small private abdication, was closer to a structure quietly discovering, one supporting wall at a time, that it had never been built to hold the weight it had spent 3 centuries assuming it could carry indefinitely. Collapse was the word the histories would eventually settle on, the word Osaru herself used in the archive's final formal entry, filed the week the Ascendancy's registry was folded by treaty into a shared archive jointly administered by the new Provisional Council and what remained of the old capital's civil service. But even collapse undersold, she thought, rereading Ferrin's 4-hour accounting one final time before the file closed forever, the specific, almost delicate mechanism of it. Not a wall knocked down by force, but a doctrine that had simply never been tested against a species patient enough and frightened enough for people it loved to let an empire believe it had already won. She entered her closing note in the record herself, in her own hand rather than dictated, because some entries, she had decided, deserved that much care. The Ascendancy did not fall because Earth was strong. It fell because it had spent 3 centuries mistaking the absence of a challenge for the absence of a weakness, and because, on one campaign among 1142, the challenge finally arrived from a species that had spent its own considerably shorter history learning to survive exactly the kind of patience that doctrine never thought to guard against. Aoife Marsh was 21 years old when the last Ossian garrison lifted off Sol 3 for good, and she stood on the roof of what had once been the Jura Foothills Bunker's surface relay station, repurposed now, like most of the table's old infrastructure, into something that didn't need to hide anymore, watching a sky that had not held an Ascendancy hull in 6 weeks, and did not feel, if she was honest with herself, very much like celebrating. Deacon Ross found her there an hour before the broadcast, carrying 2 cups of something that had been coffee before the supply lines got complicated and was now mostly a gesture in coffee's general direction, and sat down beside her on the relay housing without saying anything for a while, which was, of everything he'd taught her in the year since Silas died, the thing she'd come to value most. "They're calling it a dissolution," he said eventually. "Not a surrender, not a defeat. A dissolution like it just came apart on its own, quietly in a back room somewhere, and nobody in particular did it." "Somebody did it," Aoife said. "Lots of somebodies. Governors who wanted a chair, tribute worlds who got tired of being afraid. A marshal who wanted to beat a rival to a filing deadline." He handed her one of the cups. "And a girl who blew up a fuel depot on 11 days' notice, because a man who loved her like a daughter told her the floor would hold if she trusted the numbers. I didn't do it alone." "Nobody said you did. I said you were standing on the crack." He looked out at the sky, gray and flat and ordinary, the same light that had fallen over this stretch of hillside every autumn morning of her whole life. Silas used to say the doctrine's whole problem was that it only ever tested itself against worlds that believed their own weakness. He spent 31 years making sure that, when Ferrin's fleet finally looked at us, it wouldn't find a world that believed anything of the kind. He never got to see if it worked. "He knew it worked," Aoife said. "He knew it in the tunnel. That's why he stayed on the roof." The broadcast came at dusk, carried on frequencies the long table had built decades before anyone thought they'd carry anything but warnings. A formal notice, translated into 41 languages by systems Earth's own linguists, had spent 6 years quietly preparing against exactly this contingency, confirming what every intercepted relay feed for the last 2 weeks had already suggested, that the Ossian Ascendancy, 3 centuries old, 1142 worlds deep at the height of its reach, no longer existed as a governing body, that its former tribute territories were, effective immediately, released from all standing writs of compliance, and that any world wishing to establish independent contact with the fragmenting remnant of Ascendancy space should direct inquiries to a newly formed Provisional Council whose seat, in a detail the broadcast delivered without any particular emphasis, as though it were simply one administrative fact among many, was located on a world called Earth. Aoife listened to the whole thing standing on the relay roof with a cup of not-quite coffee going cold in her hand, and when it ended, She did not cheer, and neither did Ross, and neither, across 6 continents and a network of bunkers 31 years in the building, did most of the people who had spent their lives quietly preparing for a war they had hoped, every single day of that preparation, they would never actually have to fight. She found her mother and Toby 3 days later, in the corridor housing block that had stopped needing to pretend it didn't exist, and the reunion was smaller and quieter than anything Aoife had let herself imagine during the worst of the withdrawal, which was, she understood almost as soon as it happened, exactly the point of it. Aoife Marsh did not ask about the gash healing along her daughter's forearm, or about the 11 days between the depot and the withdrawal that Aoife had not been able to send word during, or about Silas Voll, whose name Renata had known for 4 years, without ever once being permitted to meet the man attached to it. She simply held her daughter for a length of time that would have been awkward between them a decade earlier and was not awkward now. And Toby, 11 years old and considerably less interested in solemnity than either woman standing over him, asked whether it was true that Aoife had blown up an entire city block, and whether she could show him how, and Aoife found herself laughing for what felt like the first time in a season. Not because the question was funny, but because a boy who had spent 6 weeks in unregistered housing still had room in him to ask it. Not the whole block, she told him, just the part underneath it. There's a difference, and someday, if you ever need to know it, I'll teach it to you properly. Is that a threat? Renata asked, dry. The first joke either of them had managed in longer than Aoife could easily count. And Aoife said it wasn't, not exactly, and understood saying it, that some version of the long table's 31 years of quiet preparation was going to outlive the war it had been built for, passed down the way her own instructors had passed it down to her, whether the galaxy on the other side of that preparation ever needed it again or not. She thought about her mother's building, still standing in Geneva with the flag long since taken down. She thought about Silas Voll's stopwatch, which she had kept, though she had never once found the nerve to use it for anything. She thought about the exact 11 seconds of a firefight she had heard over an open comm channel, and would go on hearing, in the quiet parts of nights, for longer than she suspected she currently understood. What happens now? She said, not really asking. Now, Ross said, we find out what we're for when nobody's invading. She had gone, that morning before the broadcast, to the rooftop where Silas had spent the last 11 seconds of his life buying her a detonation window, because someone had finally cleared it of Ossian patrol routes and marked it, quietly, with nothing more than a plain stone slab bearing his name, and the 31 years he'd spent underground making sure other people's children got to grow up. She had brought his stopwatch, the one she'd kept in a jacket pocket through the depot, through the withdrawal, through 11 days of a war she still hadn't fully finished grieving, and she had not left it there in the end, because some things a person needed to keep carrying rather than set down, but she had stood over the marker long enough to say, out loud, to a rooftop that had heard the truth of him more clearly than any memorial service ever would, that the floor had held. That the numbers he'd taught her to trust had done exactly what he'd promised they would, on the one day it mattered most, and that she intended to spend a considerable portion of whatever came next finding out what a person like her was supposed to become once the floor didn't need constant checking anymore. The Provisional Council that took its seat on Earth in the weeks following the dissolution broadcast was not, in any sense the old Ascendancy registry would have recognized, a government of conquerors. It was a working committee of delegates from 6 of the Compact of the Unanswered Hale's 19 founding worlds, 3 neutral parties who had never paid Ascendancy tribute at all, and a Terran Assembly delegation headed. In a detail the history books would linger on longer than almost anything else about the war, by First Minister Idris Akafar, the same gray-haired woman whose rehearsed surrender had once convinced a Grand Marshal that a planet was finished. She opened the Council's first session not with a victory address, but with an apology to the 6 worlds whose citizens Earth's own doctrine had, however necessarily, left in the dark about a plan 31 years in the making. And Aoife, watching the broadcast from the same relay roof where she'd stood 2 days earlier, because it turned out old habits about where a person went to hear important news did not disappear just because the news had finally turned good, thought that was, in its own understated way, exactly the kind of thing Silas Voll would have insisted on, if anyone had thought to ask him while he was still alive to be asked. She thought that might take longer to answer than the war had, and she thought, standing on a roof under a sky that finally, genuinely, belonged to no one but the planet underneath it, that she was willing to spend the time finding out. Somewhere behind her, 400 meters under bedrock that had held for 31 years in one campaign, the Long Table's demolition corps was already beginning the slow, unglamorous work of deciding what a defense doctrine built entirely around denying an enemy everything it needed was supposed to become, now that there was no enemy left standing close enough to deny anything to at all. Aoife Marsh finished her cold coffee, watched the last color drain out of a sky that had, for one autumn day and 40 days after it, belonged to a Grand Marshal who had never once checked whether the floor beneath 1142 conquered worlds could hold the weight of a 12th that had simply, patiently, refused to fall. It hadn't. That was the whole of it in the end, not a victory speech, not a single decisive battle fought and won under a flag, but a floor examined too late by a man who had spent a career not needing to examine anything, giving way all at once under worlds that had been waiting, some of them for centuries, for someone to prove it could. Earth had been given 6 turns to fall. It had taken the rest of the Ascendancy considerably longer to understand that it never had.